of us who could travel to the West, probably on grants to various universities, regularly encountered good-willing but terribly naive Western intellectuals who were very enthusiastic about communism and, in general, Marxist ideas. And we were quite shocked to find how generously forgiving they all were of communist totalitarian systems. And I'm not going to even cite, I don't want to embarrass ourselves by citing, for example, what Nicolae Ceausescu, those wonderful accolades that Nicolae Ceausescu received from many Western leaders in the 70s and 80s, because we like many of them. But what is, I think, more important is that we all met these intellectuals who so blindly embraced communism, communist ideas, and we regularly got into arguments with them. But they still refuse to consider the facts or understand that their romanticization ultimately harmed our own hopes for a better life. Let me name a few instances where the good grades were not earned, or at least we didn't think they were earned, by policies and historical events, and where we detected an underlying bias. Here are some well-known opinions. Communism did much to educate the people. For one, it got rid of illiteracy. I remember in 1981, I heard it in New York on at the parade on, I don't know, 2nd Avenue. Free healthcare was an achievement difficult to match, they would say. The social benefits of communism were very progressive. Communism did much to level social differences. Crime was unknown in communist societies. Women enjoyed a wealth of social benefits during communism. Now, of course, each of these statements contains a grain of truth, but very often, indeed, in an Orwellian fashion. Let's go through the list. Education. Well, the communists inherited a pretty well-established education system, and true, they managed to retain its competitiveness in several fields for quite a long time. But education not being a top priority, the legacy is extremely poor. In 1990, only 6.1% of all Hungarian women had college or university education, and only 8.1% of the men. 70% of the women and 60% of the men had only 8 years of schooling in 1990. Professionals, and especially intellectuals, were viewed with suspicion and distrust. Of course, there was an obvious hypocrisy here. The political elite controlled its power by restricting general access to such obvious privileges as higher education. Healthcare, to go on with my list, healthcare was never really free. First of all, every surgery, every doctor's visit had a set black market price. Everyone was required to tip doctors and nurses, which was humiliating for both patient and doctor. Healthcare was not free for another reason too. The fees of a general 44% social security health insurance was deducted from our state salaries before they showed up as a gross figure. And during communism's 45 years in Hungary, healthcare became such a disaster area that the country began to lead various cancer and other mortality statistics. Nowhere in Europe did more women die of uterus cancer or more men of heart disease and circulatory diseases than in Hungary. And finally, a baby boy born in Hungary in 1990 had a life expectancy of 66 years. Communism indeed homogenized society, but homogenized it at the lowest level. Only the communist nomenclatura enjoyed extra benefits. Otherwise, both the middle class and the workers and peasants came to lose a lot. The middle class was decapitated through political terror in the 1950s, and later by more subtle forms of discrimination, like having their property confiscated or losing access to fair treatment in the professions. Losing their property was earlier, in the 40s, obviously. While the workers and peasants were uprooted and pushed into housing blocks very similar to inner city ghettos in the US. Crime. Communist societies never had official crime statistics. But anyway, crime is nowhere a major problem in police states, where the police were all over the streets, the secret police all over the private sphere. And women, well, indeed, women did enjoy such benefits as maternity leave or retirement at 55, liberal abortion laws, full employment, supposedly free healthcare, and supposedly free education. But as I will argue in the next part of my talk, these supposed benefits had rather dubious consequences. So I want to turn now to the topic of women and address some issues related to post-communist, to the situation of women in post-communist societies. First, some general points. One, women in Central and Eastern Europe were affected by a double legacy: pre-World War II patriarchal and post-World War II communist traditions. Two, the social benefits women enjoyed during communism strengthened already existing patriarchal mentalities. Three, women have had huge difficulties in meeting new challenges during our transition to post-totalitarian system, our post-totalitarian present, because they had suffered a political and gender dependency, a dependency on both state and men. The problem of women in these communist countries was complex in more than one way. Not only were women victims of communism's totalitarian grip, but also of the patriarchal traditions widespread in other parts of Europe as well. It is easy to misapprehend and misinterpret this double legacy, especially the way the 4.5 decades of communism created their own double twist on the institutions of patriarchy. Pre-1945 Central and Eastern European societies were clearly patriarchal, offering limited choices to women and stressing traditional feminine ideals. Excuse me. True, Western societies, Western Europe and the United States, also revealed many symptoms of their own patriarchies, but in the West there came the 1960s, when patriarchy was substantially dismantled by the civil rights movement, itself strengthened by a long history of the women's movement. East of the Iron Curtain, however, the 1960s were not the 60s, as usually understood. These 1960s were characterized by the tightening of police control and the lack of any civil rights politicization whatsoever. I remember very well 1966. We were just coming out of our high school dance class, and we were walking out in groups, as you would do from a dance class, and the police were all over the streets, and they told us to disperse. It was October 23rd, 1966. They were just so afraid that, and we looked, I think, so dangerous, being 14, that they had to do something. So the tightening of police control. Here, the 1960s was not the decade of emergent feminism, demands for social equality, or the critique of racism and sexism. At best, our 1960s were characterized by a belated disillusionment in communist communism among leftist intellectuals. This ultimate disillusionment was triggered by the Prague events of 1968, but actually not the uprising, but its crushing by Warsaw Pact tanks. Occurring 12 years after the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, a landmark historical event with the potential for many of revealing the downsides of the communist system. So the real 60s had to wait until the 1990s for after the fall of communism and its totalitarian regimes. And during this time, the pre-World War II patriarchy became only more solid in Eastern Europe, surviving as an undercurrent to what looked on the surface as emancipation. True, state socialism's own women's lib did happen, yet in truth it was anything but liberation. It was rather one last gasp of patriarchy, of paternalistic state socialism, beautifully resonating with pre-war mentalities. Observers, especially in the 1970s and 80s, often misunderstood the status of women in Central Europe. Visitors got the impression that women were very Western in Prague, Bratislava, Warsaw, or Budapest. They dressed well, looked very educated, were educated, often, and led a semi-Western lifestyle. What could not be visible to short-term tourists, though, was how much time, energy, and money had to be spent in keeping up this seemingly Western, yet immensely modest lifestyle. Nor was it apparent to what degree they lived in a communist society with patriarchal norms. And there is another reason why communism's long-lasting damage in the social fabric was not given a proper estimation. And that is that women, along with other marginal groups of post-communism, were a muted culture. Most women in Eastern Europe accepted their woman's lot as a series of natural catastrophes, where passivity and patience were the best or only survival strategy, quietly standing aside and waiting for the storm to pass. Eastern Europeans did not possess a vocabulary of political concepts when civil rights and liberties were curbed. No political discourse was available with which to articulate their gender-specific grievances. That is why the myths that I listed at the beginning of my talk were never really contested or critiqued in public, or the supposed benefits that women enjoyed in communist societies, such as full employment, health care, maternity leave, and cheap abortion, were not examined. Not that we believed everything, for we knew well enough that these benefits only sounded appealing to foreign observers, to whom these words had different and much more positive meanings. In Hungarian, as well as Czech, Slovak, Polish, or Russian, these words sounded pitiful, cheap, poor, and gloomy because that was the reality they evoked. When we heard about free healthcare, for example, we did not picture an American hospital, but an overcrowded, undermanned, under-equipped, underdeveloped third world hospital in Eastern Europe, where social security costs did not actually cover hospital fees and where doctors and nurses had to be tipped. Or when we heard about maternity leave, we knew how much this benefit actually paid and how the practice generated underachievement. Only later did we become fully aware of the fact that these communist accomplishments all proved to be myths. The myth of full employment put women into underachieving jobs. The myth of free healthcare left them with rapidly deteriorating health and a complete lack of health awareness. The myth of social benefits strengthened patriarchal mentalities. And Hungarian women have paid dearly for these so-called benefits. They paid by perpetuating patriarchy under the disguise of communist ideology. Or to take another example, what is behind the myth of full employment? These are the facts, and I need to repeat some. Only 6.1% of Hungarian women and 8.1% of Hungarian men had college degrees. 70% of all women had only 8 years of schooling or less. 54% had on-the-job training only, and 6.1% of women, sorry, the previous one was about women too, did secretarial work. Given the fact that full employment applied to women too in communist states, is it any wonder that in terms of occupational segregation, they occupied the bottom of the pyramid? So women made up 99% of kindergarten teachers, 4/5 of elementary school teachers, half of high school teachers, and 1/3 of college and university instructors. In the Budapest School of Economics, 2/3 of the lower level instructors, up to the rank of assistant professor, were women, but only 0.4% of the full professors. And I am talking about the communist years. As a feminist, I have been extremely skeptical about the supposed social benefits of communism because they bred a political climate of dependence. They strengthened patriarchal mentalities about women's domestic priorities, of the male imperative of achieving, politics as an exclusively manly sport, and women's worth outside the home versus the family, in the family. Communism's social welfare was a blessing in disguise, strengthening patriarchal values, male dominance, female dependence, and female domesticity. It perpetuated the wage gap and the occupational segregation of women, but it sent achievement-related values into an unreachable distance. Communism favored those who accepted a uniform and monolithic society, but stigmatized those who subscribed to identity, difference, and diversity. But as always, it is not easy to assess the nature of the times for contemporaries. These are still transitory times, haunted by the times they follow, rather than those they precede. They are retrospective rather than anticipatory. Probably Françoise Thom, Sovietologist of the Sorbonne, is right in using the image of Chernobyl, as the metaphor for our times. Communism ends like Chernobyl, she says, leaving radioactive material all around, needing decades or centuries to decompose. But before the actual cleanup, it is necessary that we know exactly what radioactive waste we are dealing with. So we have to start objectively estimating the various legacies of communism, the poisonous ones too, or primarily probably, without prejudice, without bias, without romanticization. And this assessment must include identifying the legacies that have affected women as well as men. Thank you for your attention.